Hello, my name is Aron Reppmann. I live in Evergreen Park, Illinois. I'm a professor of philosophy at Trinity Christian College and a member of Hope Christian Reformed Church, where I'm also an ordained elder. I count myself as a friend of many people who identify themselves variously as gay, lesbian, bisexual, genderqueer, or non-binary. These include a close member of my own family, members of our church congregation, friends and peers in various places, and current and former students at Trinity Christian College. I want to talk to you about an aspect of the CRC's recently released Human Sexuality Report that is particularly concerning to me as a Christian philosopher in the Reformed tradition of faith and thinking. That aspect is the way the authors of the report interpret and use the concept of creation order. The idea of creation order is a good and important one. One of the hallmarks of Reformed Christian spirituality is our commitment to learning about God's purposes for the world, not only from Scripture, but also by giving close attention to how the world as God's creation is structured and ordered. Carefully seeking out the created orderliness of the world is important, and Christian philosophers and theologians in the Reformed tradition rightly give a lot of attention to this. But the authors of the Human Sexuality Report choose to interpret creation order in a very narrow and rigid way. I'm talking about their equating creation order with natural law. The idea of natural law is that all the standards for human behavior are built in from the original creation on, so that living in a faithful, properly ordered way simply means finding out the once-for-all built-in standard and keeping to it. This natural law interpretation of creation order would mean that everything about sexual identity, experience, and behavior was completely defined and strictly governed by a set of physical characteristics, specifically the sexual organs and their reproductive purposes. This natural law understanding of creation order runs through the whole report. On page 15, the authors state that in Matthew 19, Jesus understands sexuality in creational terms. On page 16, they assert that Genesis 1 and 2 is about God's creative work of establishing order in the cosmos. And on the following page, they state that God created human beings with binary, procreative sexuality. And on page 99, they describe creation order as the pattern for sexual relations given in the creation narratives. The report uses this natural law approach to condemn both same-sex unions and questions of gender identity. Speaking of same-sex marriage, the authors write that it is, quote, unnatural and wrong, because such conduct goes against one's created nature. It is contrary to the way in which God made each sex physically so that male and female fit the other in a natural way and can fulfill the Genesis command to be fruitful and multiply. That's from page 108. And speaking of gender identity, they write, the idea of gender identity itself is a recent breakdown from the conventional assumption that sex differences were fixed and normative. They go on to disapprove of contemporary phrases like sex assigned at birth, as if they were an outright denial of creation order. But this fixed natural law interpretation is not the best way of understanding creation order, especially because it overlooks God's call for human beings to be responsibly creative. It may be helpful to unpack a related phrase that the report uses in talking about creation order, namely creational norms. When philosophers use the term norm, we don't mean it in the social science sense of customary behavior. When philosophers say norm, we're actually echoing an older meaning of this term. In contemporary English, we call this tool a square or a carpenter's square, and we use it as a standard to gauge the rightness of what we have decided to build. Well, an ancient Roman carpenter, speaking the Latin language, would call this same tool norma, which is where we get our philosophical use of the words norm and normative. The tool has not changed, and the angles that it measures are built into the creation order. But the norm does not have all the content of human behavior, of human building, included in it. A norm is instructive, but it's not totally prescriptive. And its flexibility means that we can still use this tool today for building with materials and designs that our ancient Roman carpenter could never have imagined. Now, the narrower natural law approach leads the report's authors to misapply Jesus' teaching in Matthew 19 as ruling out the legitimacy of same-sex marriage. The report takes Jesus' reference there to the creation of humans as male and female as if it were intended to present a full-blown and exclusive natural law system. But in fact, Jesus is not talking about the overall structure of sexuality at all. Instead, Jesus is responding to a question about whether a man has a right to divorce his wife for whatever reasons he chooses. So the actual creational principle at stake here, the norm that Jesus invokes, is not about the fixed essential nature of male and female. The norm is that of covenant faithfulness. Interpreting the reference to male and female as if it were the natural law point of the story conveniently sidesteps an important question of how to apply the norm in our own time. What does it look like to practice covenant faithfulness also in a stable same-sex union, now that stable same-sex unions are part of our experience and our cultural reality? Even though the building materials of such a union were not imagined at the time of the biblical writers, the norm is still a faithful guide to our ongoing discernment, our God-given human responsibility in our new circumstances. The norm does not dictate the terms of our human experience, but it helps us to order our responsible fashioning of that experience. This understanding of creational norms as calling forth God-given human responsibility also opens up a more generous approach to gender identity. The report takes offense at the contemporary phrase, sex assigned at birth, as if it were a denial of creation order. But if we keep in mind that creation order actually includes human beings called by God to be responsively and creatively adaptive, that sheds a rather different light on gender identity. Consider an episode in the creation story not addressed by the Human Sexuality Report. In Genesis 2, verse 19, we read that God brought all the creatures to the man to see what he would call them. And whatever the man called every living creature, that was its name. God brought the creatures to the human being to see what he would call them. To see what he would call them. And then God honored the names that the man gave to the creatures. Humanity's God-given calling is to assign names and categories, doing so with responsible creativity. So when a physician examines a newborn baby and makes a determination of sex, that is the physician's right and responsibility at that time. And normally, the parents confirm that determination, and that too is their right and responsibility, at least for the time being, because as newborns, we're incapable of taking such responsibility for ourselves. But a mark of the growing, maturing person is to take on responsibility for oneself, to become not only named, but also a namer. As we come to take responsibility, to respond to who and how we find ourselves to be, that normally includes both some affirmation and some alteration of what has previously been assigned by those who were responsible for us before. Now, we do not know precisely why some of us experience that they don't fit their previously assigned sexual categories, but it is undeniable that they do. The Reformed hallmark of interpreting the world in terms of creation order does not require us to condemn such experience as unnatural, based on a fixed, once-and-for-all determinism. Rather, it calls us to ongoing discernment, discovering together how to be responsibly responsive and faithfully flexible here and now.